In August 1944, the German High Command was already facing a military disaster in Western Europe. Just 2 months earlier, Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlord had shattered Hitler's defensive wall along the French coast, and the German army in France was now struggling to contain the rapidly advancing Allied armies. Yet despite the worsening situation, Adolf Hitler still believed that the war in the West could be stabilized. German propaganda insisted that the Allied landings had been contained, and that powerful counterattacks would soon drive the enemy back into the sea. Inside the Führer headquarters, however, the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. American, British, and Canadian forces were advancing steadily through Normandy, pushing German divisions into a chaotic retreat. Cities and towns across northern France were falling one after another. Each new report that arrived at Hitler's headquarters carried the same troubling message. The front was collapsing faster than German commanders could reorganize their defenses. For Hitler, France held enormous strategic and symbolic importance. The country had been conquered in 1940 in one of Germany's most stunning military victories. The fall of Paris had shocked the world and cemented Nazi Germany's reputation as an unstoppable force. German troops had marched triumphantly through the French capital, while Hitler himself visited the city shortly after its capture, standing before the Eiffel Tower as cameras recorded the moment. That victory had defined the early years of the war. Now, 4 years later, the same territory was slipping back into Allied hands. The liberation of Paris would not only represent a military defeat, but also a devastating blow to Nazi prestige. Hitler believed the city must not fall intact into Allied hands. As reports from France grew increasingly alarming, he began issuing orders that revealed the depth of his frustration and desperation. The German garrison in Paris was instructed to hold the city at all costs. If the situation became hopeless, the capital was to be destroyed rather than surrendered. While Hitler issued increasingly severe orders from his headquarters, the situation inside France was changing rapidly. Allied forces were advancing from Normandy toward the heart of the country with growing momentum. The breakout from the Normandy beachhead in late July had transformed the battlefield. American armored divisions surged south and east through the German lines, exploiting weak points and forcing large sections of the German army into retreat. At the same time, British and Canadian forces pressed forward from the north, placing enormous pressure on German positions across northern France. The German command structure was beginning to unravel under the strain. Communication between units became increasingly chaotic as commanders attempted to regroup, shattered divisions, and form new defensive lines. Many German soldiers were exhausted after weeks of relentless combat. Supplies were running low, fuel shortages were becoming severe, and Allied air power dominated the skies. German convoys attempting to move during daylight were frequently attacked by fighter bombers that roamed the roads of France almost uncontested. Inside Paris itself, tensions were rising among both civilians and German authorities. The French capital had remained under German occupation since June 1940. For 4 years, the city had lived under strict control, with German soldiers patrolling its streets and Nazi flags flying over major buildings. Yet by August 1944, the mood in the city was changing dramatically. News of the Allied advance was spreading quickly through the population. French resistance groups, which had been operating underground for years, began preparing for an uprising. Secret messages circulated through the city as resistance fighters gathered weapons and organized barricades. German authorities attempted to maintain control, but their position was growing increasingly uncertain. Many officers understood that Paris was becoming difficult to defend. The city was enormous, and German forces stationed there were limited. If large-scale fighting erupted within the city, while Allied forces approached from outside, the situation could quickly spiral beyond their control. On August 19, 1944, the situation inside Paris exploded into open rebellion. French resistance groups launched an uprising across the city, attacking German positions and seizing key buildings. Barricades appeared on streets throughout the capital as civilians joined the resistance fighters. French police units that had previously served under German authority now turned against the occupation forces and joined the revolt. Gunfire echoed through the streets as resistance fighters attempted to take control of government buildings, railway stations, and communication centers. The German garrison, commanded by General Dietrich von Choltitz, suddenly faced a complex and dangerous situation. The uprising had effectively turned the city into a battlefield, even before the Allied armies had arrived. German troops attempted to regain control of several districts, but the scale of the resistance activity made it difficult to suppress the revolt quickly. Meanwhile, Allied forces were moving rapidly toward the city. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had originally intended to bypass Paris and continue the advance toward Germany. Military planners feared that fighting within the large urban area could slow the Allied advance and create logistical difficulties. However, the uprising inside Paris changed the situation dramatically. Allowing the resistance to fight alone against the German garrison risked a devastating bloodbath within the city. French leaders also insisted that Paris must be liberated by Allied forces as soon as possible. The political importance of the capital was enormous. The liberation of Paris would send a powerful signal that France was returning to Allied control and that the German occupation was collapsing. As resistance fighters continued battling German forces inside the city, Allied commanders made the decision to move toward Paris. French and American units began advancing toward the capital, racing to reach the city before the situation deteriorated further. As Allied forces approached the outskirts of Paris, Adolf Hitler received alarming reports about the rapidly deteriorating situation. German forces across France were retreating in multiple directions, and the defensive lines that had once protected the capital had effectively collapsed. Yet Hitler refused to accept the idea that Paris could be surrendered. In a furious directive transmitted through the German chain of command, he issued one of the most infamous orders of the war. Paris, he declared, must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. Bridges across the Seine were to be destroyed, historic monuments were to be demolished, and the entire city was to be reduced to rubble if German forces could no longer hold it. Hitler believed that denying the Allies the symbolic victory of capturing Paris intact would damage their morale and demonstrate Germany's continued resolve. The responsibility for carrying out this order fell to General Dietrich von Choltitz, the German military governor of Paris. Von Choltitz had arrived in the city only weeks earlier, and now faced an impossible decision. On one hand, he was a German officer bound by orders from the highest authority in the Nazi state. On the other hand, he understood the catastrophic consequences of destroying one of Europe's greatest cities. Paris contained centuries of cultural history, iconic landmarks, and millions of civilians. Carrying out Hitler's command would turn the capital into a devastated battlefield and cause immense suffering. Allied forces continued advancing toward the city, and resistance fighters tightened their grip on key areas. Von Choltitz began quietly reconsidering the order. The German position in Paris was weakening by the hour. Supplies were dwindling, reinforcements were unlikely to arrive, and the Allied armies were drawing closer with every passing day. By August 24th, Allied forces had reached the outskirts of Paris. French armored units of the 2nd Armored Division, supported by American infantry, began pushing toward the city center. Resistance fighters inside Paris intensified their efforts, guiding Allied troops through the streets and helping identify German strongpoints. Crowds of civilians gathered along the roads as Allied vehicles entered the capital. After 4 years of occupation, the sight of Allied soldiers moving through the streets triggered scenes of celebration across the city. Yet fighting had not completely ended. German troops still controlled several defensive positions and continued exchanging fire with advancing Allied forces and resistance fighters. The battle for Paris was now unfolding district by district as the German garrison faced the final stage of the confrontation. At German headquarters, the news reaching Hitler became increasingly grim. Reports confirmed that Allied units had entered the city and that the German defensive perimeter had collapsed. Communication with some units inside Paris was already breaking down as the situation deteriorated. Hitler repeatedly demanded confirmation that his orders had been carried out. Were the bridges destroyed? Had the city been demolished? The responses arriving from the field were vague and increasingly evasive. In reality, General von Choltitz had already made his decision. Rather than carrying out the destruction of Paris, he had begun negotiating with the advancing Allied forces. On August 25, 1944, the German garrison officially surrendered. Paris had been liberated. When Adolf Hitler learned that Paris had fallen into Allied hands largely intact, the reaction inside his headquarters was one of rage and disbelief. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed the conquest of France as one of Germany's greatest triumphs. Now the same city that had symbolized Nazi dominance in Western Europe had been lost. Worse still, it had been lost without the destruction Hitler had demanded. The images emerging from Paris showed cheering crowds, French flags returning to public buildings, and Allied troops marching through the streets. Instead of ruins, the city stood largely untouched. For Hitler, the moment represented more than a military setback. It was a public demonstration that Germany's hold over Western Europe was collapsing. The liberation of Paris also carried enormous strategic significance for the broader course of the war. With the French capital secured, Allied forces could now establish supply routes and logistical centers to support the continued advance toward Germany. French political leadership returned to the city as General Charles de Gaulle declared the restoration of French authority. Across Europe, the news of Paris's liberation signaled that the Nazi occupation was beginning to crumble. For the German leadership, however, the event marked another step toward inevitable defeat. The war that had once seemed unstoppable for Germany was now turning decisively against it. When Hitler realized that Paris had been captured by the Allies, it confirmed a reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The balance of power in Europe had shifted, and the collapse of Nazi Germany was now only a matter of time.